One of the great endeavors of archaeology is figuring out which events described in the Bible actually happened. We know Jesus lived, had a lot of followers, and that he was crucified. That is all historical fact. It's what happened after he was crucified that depends on your faith. But with the emergence of modern astronomy and evolutionary biology, the book of Genesis hasn't held up as well. But hang on, because researchers in Turkey now claim they found indisputable evidence that the story of Noah's Ark was not a cautionary tale about the consequences of forsaking God, but a verifiable historical event.
Stop what you're doing and look at this image. You are looking at a subterranean radar scan taken 18 miles south of Mount Ararat in Turkey. Mainstream science told you this was a rock. They told you it was a natural formation. They told you the story of a global flood was a fairy tale for children. New ground-penetrating radar has just revealed something buried under the mud that shouldn't exist. It has right angles, it has parallel walls, it has a central corridor exactly 13 feet wide, and it is exactly, to the inch, the length of the vessel described in the book of Genesis. Researchers from a trio of universities in Turkey and the United States have spent roughly a year using technology that did not exist 10 years ago and have just completed a ground-penetrating radar survey of a site known as the Durapunar Formation. And what they saw on their screens has sent a shockwave of panic through the archaeological establishment. They found a shape that matches the exact dimensions down to the inch of the vessel described in the book of Genesis. We are going to look at the classified scans, the chemical footprints, and the impossible geometry that suggests the greatest cover-up in human history is finally unraveling.
Now, Andrew, you are part of Noah's Ark scans, and you've been getting a lot of press right now because Noah's Ark is always one of those things that people for years have wanted to prove and find evidence of, and you're doing a lot of work in this area. Before we get into that work, where did your interest in Noah's Ark stem from?
Well, actually, as a child, a guy named Ron Wyatt came out to California and did a presentation. And I was in middle school back in the early 90s, and I heard about it. I decided I had to go there when I got a chance. And so in college in 1997, that was my first trip to see this boat formation in Turkey. And I've been going back and forth ever since.
To understand the magnitude of this, we have to talk about the numbers. Numbers are dangerous to the establishment because numbers do not lie. People lie. Governments lie. Even history books can lie. But mathematics is a universal language. If you open the Bible to Genesis chapter 6, verse 15, you find a blueprint. It is a set of instructions given to a man facing the end of the world. The text says, "The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits." For over a century, skeptics have used these numbers to mock the story. They grabbed their calculators, used the standard Hebrew cubit of 18 inches, and said, "Look, that's only 450 feet. It's too small to hold all the animals, but too big to be seaworthy without steel reinforcement. A wooden boat of that size would snap in half in rough seas." And for a long time, that argument held water, but they were using the wrong ruler. You have to remember who wrote the account: Moses. And where was Moses educated? In the royal courts of Egypt. He would not have used the common Hebrew cubit. He would have used the royal Egyptian cubit, the measurement of the pharaohs. A royal Egyptian cubit is exactly 20.62 inches. Now do the math again. 300 royal cubits times 20.62 inches equals exactly 515 feet. Now let's fly over the mountains of Turkey. Let's look at the Durapunar site. It is a massive boat-shaped mound rising out of the earth. It is pointed at the bow, blunt at the stern, and streamlined in a way that hydrodynamics experts say is perfect for riding out a massive tsunami. When you measure this formation from tip to tail, do you know what the length is? It is exactly 515 feet. Not 500, not 550, 515. What are the statistical odds of a natural rock formation created by random tectonic shifting and erosion accidentally forming a perfect ship shape that matches the specific engineering unit of the ancient world to the exact decimal point? Is it 1 in a million, 1 in a billion, or are we looking at a man-made object? For years, the mainstream geological explanation was that this site is a syncline. A syncline is a trough or fold of stratified rock in which the strata slope upward from the axis. Basically, the Earth folded and it just happened to look like a boat. That was the official story. Move along, nothing to see here, just a funny-shaped rock. But in late 2023, the narrative collapsed. A consortium of scientists, including experts from Istanbul Technical University and the Andrew Jones Research Team, brought heavy equipment to the site. They didn't bring shovels, they brought ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, and electrical resistivity tomography, or ERT. These machines allow us to see through the solid earth, peeling back the layers of soil like the pages of a book. If the Dhuruppunar site was a natural rock formation, the radar should have shown chaos. It should have shown random cracks, uneven density, and solid bedrock. That is not what happened. The scans revealed order. Between 8 and 20 feet below the surface, the radar waves bounced off something that wasn't rock. They revealed a lattice, a grid pattern. The images show parallel walls, what shipbuilders call bulkheads, spaced at regular intervals. These lines are straight. Nature does not create straight lines in a grid pattern. Nature creates fractals, it creates curves. But this is engineering. The scans identified a central hallway running the length of the ship. They identified curved walls near the bow, exactly where the hull would curve in to cut through the water. And most terrifyingly for the skeptics, the data suggests the existence of 3 distinct layers, 3 floors. With lower, second, and third decks you shall make it. The radar sees 3 decks. The text says 3 decks. The radar sees 515 feet. The text says 515 feet. At what point does a coincidence become evidence? But to really understand why this is blowing up right now, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to understand the cover-up. Because this site wasn't found yesterday, it was found in 1959, at the height of the Cold War. Imagine the tension. The world is on the brink of nuclear war. Turkey is the eastern flank of NATO, bordering the Soviet Union. A Turkish Air Force captain named İlhan Dhuruppunar is sitting in a dark room staring at high-altitude reconnaissance photos meant for mapping NATO defenses. He is looking for Soviet movements. He is looking for missile silos. Instead, he sees a shape on a mountain, 6,300 feet above sea level. It stood out instantly. In a landscape of jagged, chaotic basalt and limestone, here was a smooth, symmetrical, boat-shaped object. It looked like someone had dropped a massive ship into a sea of mud. Captain Dhuruppunar handed the photo to his superiors. The news eventually leaked to the United States. A photogrammetry expert named Dr. Arthur Brandenberger from Ohio State University took one look at it and said, "I have no doubt that is a ship." An expedition was launched in 1960. It was a joint operation, Turkish soldiers, American scientists. They hiked up the mountain, expecting to find the ARK sitting there, ready to be entered. They expected wooden planks, maybe a door. But when they got there, they found dirt. The object was covered with grass and mud. They dug a few holes. They dynamited the side of the structure. Yes, they actually used dynamite to try and see inside. But they didn't hit hollow chambers. They hit packed earth and rock. Disappointed and embarrassed, the scientists wrote a report dismissing the site as a natural geological curiosity. They said it was just a freak of clay and landslides. The world laughed. The newspapers mocked the ARK hunters. The site was abandoned. The shepherds went back to grazing their sheep on top of it, unaware that they were walking on the roof of history. For nearly 20 years, the site sat silent. The wind eroded the dynamite scars, the grass grew back. It seemed the story was over. Then came Ron Wyatt. If you follow the world of alternative archaeology, you know the name. To some, he is a hero, a man of faith who went where academics feared to tread. To others, he is a fraud, an amateur with no degree who saw what he wanted to see. In 1977, Wyatt read an article about the site in Life magazine. He didn't have a grant, he didn't have a university tenure, he had a metal detector and an obsession. Wyatt traveled to Turkey. He walked the site, and this is where things get strange. When he swept the ground with his metal detector, he didn't get random pings, he got a pattern. He placed yellow ribbons everywhere the detector squealed. When he stepped back and looked at the ribbons, they formed distinct lines. They outlined the shape of the ship's ribs. He found that the iron readings were concentrated at regular intervals, just like the metal fittings of a massive wooden structure would be. He found petrified timber on the surface, rocks that looked like wood, had the grain of wood, but had been turned to stone by millennia of volcanic activity. He found what he claimed were rivets, fossilized washers containing aluminum and titanium, man-made alloys that mainstream history says we didn't invent until the 20th century. Wyatt screamed from the rooftops that he had found the ARK, and the scientific community crushed him. They called him a liar. They said his ribs were just iron ore veins. They said his rivets were just odd rocks. Even his own partners eventually turned on him. By the time Wyatt died in 1999, the Duru Pinar site was considered a joke, a tourist trap for the gullible. But Ron Wyatt had one thing right. There was something under that dirt. He just didn't have the technology to prove it. He was using a magnifying glass to look at the stars. Today, we have the telescope. The 2023 team didn't just look at the shape, they looked at the chemistry, and this is the smoking gun that the skeptics cannot explain away. You can argue about shapes, you can argue about radar shadows, you cannot argue about molecular chemistry. The researchers took core samples from the soil inside the boat formation and compared them to the soil outside the formation. If this is all just one mountain, the chemical composition should be identical. It's all the same dirt, right? Wrong. The soil inside the formation contained organic carbon levels that were drastically higher than the surrounding terrain. It contained high concentrations of magnesium and potassium. But the real shocker? They found traces of marine clay. They found diatoms, microscopic skeletons of sea creatures. Let that sink in. We are 6,000 feet up a mountain in eastern Turkey. We are hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean, and yet the soil inside this boat formation is packed with the chemical signature of the sea. The researchers describe it as a chemical ghost. Think about how wood decays. If a massive wooden ship is buried in wet volcanic mud for 5,000 years, the wood doesn't stay wood. It rots. The cellulose breaks down, but the carbon doesn't disappear. It seeps into the surrounding clay. It stains the earth. The ribs that the radar sees might not be timber anymore. They are the chemical shadows where the timber used to be. The iron fittings rust and bleed into the soil, creating those regular magnetic anomalies that Wyatt found with his primitive metal detector. The study, led by Dr. Farooq Kaya, confirmed that this organic decay dates back to between 5,500 and 3,000 BC. That is the exact window of time that historians and theologians have calculated for the Great Flood. So we have the shape, we have the dimensions, we have the internal structure, we have the chemical evidence of decayed wood and marine life. Why isn't this on the front page of every newspaper in the world? Why isn't this the lead story on the nightly news? Because it breaks the rules. Modern science is built on a foundation called uniformitarianism. This is the idea that the Earth changes slowly, gradually, over millions of years. Erosion, drift, sedimentation, slow, safe, predictable processes. The idea of the flood represents the opposite, catastrophism, the idea that the Earth can change instantly, violently, and globally. If the scientific establishment admits that the ARK is real, they have to admit that the flood was real. And if the flood was real, then the geological column, the timeline of rock layers they use to date the Earth, might be completely wrong. They would have to rewrite the textbooks. They would have to rethink the history of human civilization. They would have to admit that our ancestors weren't primitive cavemen, but that they were capable of building a vessel larger than any wooden ship constructed in the 19th century. It is easier to ignore the evidence than to rewrite the paradigm. It is easier to call it a natural formation than to admit that the myths were true. But the evidence doesn't stop at the site itself. If a massive ship rode out a global tsunami and came to rest on these mountains, there should be debris. There should be a trail. And there is. A few miles from the Durapunar site, there is a village. It used to be called Arzap. In the ancient local language, Arzap translates to, "He turned the river." Today the village is called Kazan. Scattered throughout this village and the surrounding fields are massive, upright stones. They weigh thousands of pounds. They are made of volcanic rock, and every single one of them has a hole drilled perfectly through the top. Archaeologists call them Armenian gravestones or pagan shrines. But look at them with the eyes of a sailor. These are not gravestones. These are drogue stones. In a storm, a long, boxy ship like the ARK is in danger of capsizing if it gets turned sideways to the waves. To survive, you need to keep the bow pointed into the wind. You do this by dragging heavy weights behind the ship on long ropes. These weights create drag, pulling the ship straight. These stones in the village are the exact shape and design of ancient drogue anchors found at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Only these are 10 times bigger, and there are dozens of them, lining the path leading up to the mountain. It is a trail of breadcrumbs. As the floodwaters began to recede, as the ARK approached the shallows, Noah would have cut the ropes. The stones would have plummeted to the bottom, one by one. The village names tell the story too. There is a location nearby called the Valley of the Eight. The Bible says there were 8 people on the ARK: Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. 8 people. Why would a random valley in Turkey be named the Valley of the Eight? Another nearby place is named Nasser. In ancient translations, it means making fast, nautical terminology for securing a ship. The locals have preserved the memory of what happened here in the names of their towns, but we, with our degrees and our satellites, have forgotten how to listen. There is another piece of the puzzle that is often overlooked: the impossible fossils. In the region surrounding the site, at altitudes that defy logic, researchers have found beds of fossilized shellfish. Not just any shellfish, saltwater mollusks. Now the skeptics will say, oh, that's from millions of years ago when this land was under the ocean. But the fossils tell a different story. When a fish dies in the ocean, it floats or it rots, it gets eaten. It does not fossilize perfectly intact unless it is buried instantly. To get a fossil bed, you need a catastrophe. You need a massive, sudden influx of mud and sediment that traps the animals alive. The preservation of these fossils suggests rapid, violent burial, the kind of burial you would expect from a global flood. Let's go back to the scans. The most haunting part of the 2023 survey is the door. The Bible describes a massive door on the side of the ARK, which was shut by God. On the starboard side of the Durapunar formation, the radar shows a distinct structural anomaly, a blockage, a solid man-made barrier that seems to lead into the hollow cavities of the second deck. The research team is currently applying for permits to drill specifically into this area. They want to send a camera down. Imagine that moment. Imagine the fiber optic cable snaking down through 20 feet of frozen mud, pushing through the decayed remnants of the hull and popping out into a void. What would be in there? Would the interior be filled with mud, or would there be sealed chambers? Could there be artifacts, tools, records? Some theorists believe that the Ark wasn't just a zoo. They believe it was a library. If you knew the world was ending, if you knew that all of human knowledge, all of your technology, all of your history was about to be erased by water, wouldn't you try to save it? Wouldn't you pack the blueprints of civilization along with the animals? There are legends that say Noah preserved the books of the pre-flood world. If even a scrap of writing, a single tablet, or a piece of technology survived inside that structure, it would be the most significant discovery since the invention of writing itself. It would connect us to our lost heritage. And perhaps that is what the powers that be are afraid of. We live in a world that prides itself on progress. We think we are the pinnacle of evolution. We think we are the first civilization to master engineering, mathematics, astronomy. But the Duru Pinar site whispers a different possibility. It suggests that we are not the first. We are just the survivors. It suggests that there was a time before, a golden age that ended in ruin, and if the Ark is real, then the warning it carries is real. The drilling is ongoing. The samples are being analyzed in labs across the world, often under strict non-disclosure agreements. The natural formation theory is bleeding out, dying a death of 1,000 cuts inflicted by hard data. The geometry is too perfect, the chemistry is too specific, the dimensions are too biblical. But even with all this evidence, the battle is not over. The skeptics are digging in their heels. They are writing new papers, trying to find new ways to explain the unexplainable. They will call it a fortress. They will call it a reservoir. They will call it anything but what it clearly is. Because to call it the Ark is to admit that there is a higher power, or at least a higher truth than the one they control. So where do we go from here? The team is preparing for the next phase. They are planning to expose the walls. They are planning to dig down to the keel. They are determined to bring up a piece of the ship itself. Until then, we are left with the image on the radar screen, a ghostly grid glowing blue in the darkness of the Turkish earth, a skeleton of a giant sleeping beneath the grass. I want you to look at the world around you. Look at the mountains, the valleys, the oceans. We think they are permanent, but they are not. The memory of the water is everywhere. It's in the rocks, it's in the fossils, it's in the stories we tell our children. And now it's on a radar screen in a lab in Istanbul. They found it. They tried to hide it, but the truth has a way of rising to the surface. The question is no longer, did the flood happen? The question is no longer, is the Ark real? The data has answered those questions. The new question is, now that we know, what are we going to do with that knowledge? Are we going to rewrite our history, or are we going to bury it again, terrified of what it means? The mountain is waiting, the drills are turning, and soon the silence will be broken. Keep your eyes on Ararat, because the past is about to collide with the present, and when it does, nothing will ever be the same. This is the story of the Ark, not the myth, the reality, and it is the greatest story ever discovered.